Hello, and welcome to today's conversation, UNGA 2022 and the Climate Tech Forecast. I'm Satchie Snellings, editor of live journalism and special projects at Protocol. Thank you for joining us. At Protocol, we aim to arm you as decision makers in tech, business, and policy with the news and analysis you need to navigate a world in rapid change. Between the UN General Assembly and Climate Week, it's been a busy September in New York, and there's a lot to talk about. Today, we'll be joined by Protocol climate editor Brian Kahn and a panel of climate leaders and tech executives to recap the biggest developments at UNGA 2022 and preview the trends and events that will shape the future of climate tech and the planet. We're so glad you could tune in today. If you're not already subscribed, don't forget to sign up for Protocol Climate and Protocol's family of newsletters at protocol.com/newsletters. I'm so excited to bring up Brian Kahn, our moderator for today's conversation, to introduce our speakers and get things started. Over to you, Brian.
Great. Thanks so much, Satchie. It's a pleasure to be here. And hello to everyone. I'm Brian Kahn. I'm Protocol's climate editor. I'm really excited for our conversation today. Just to give us a little bit of grounding about where we're coming from, I want to start with looking back to what just happened last week. As Satchie mentioned, it was a very busy time, and then give a sense of where we're headed going forward. So last week at the UN General Assembly, Antonio Guterres addressed world leaders, and he told them, quote, "The world is in big trouble." Now, frankly, he's right. Supply chains are pretty broken. There's a war raging in Ukraine, and the world is very far from meeting its sustainable development goals. That's particularly true when it comes to climate change. Global carbon emissions rose to a record high last year, and the impacts of the climate crisis are becoming clearer with each passing day. You can look out your window, or you can check the news and see them. Just to take two recent examples, the Horn of Africa is experiencing a drought unseen in at least 4 decades. It's got 21 million people at risk of acute food insecurity or even famine. Closer to home, there's Hurricane Fiona and Hurricane Ian, which have recently devastated Puerto Rico, Cuba, and Florida, leaving a trail of destruction and causing billions of dollars in damage. Now, it's against this backdrop that world leaders, tech visionaries, activists, and others will be meeting in Egypt in a little bit more than a month at COP27. Those are international climate talks. And what their goal is to stop this runaway train. And as Antonio Guterres put it, we need action across the board. Now, that's what we're here to talk about today. We're lucky enough to be joined by tech leaders who are thinking about that kind of action. And the industry itself has been a leader, both as a leading voice in talking about how to combat the climate crisis and in putting action and money to work to do so. I'm really excited to be joined by leaders at companies that are working to both decarbonize themselves and use their technologies to help decarbonize the supply chain and bend the global carbon emissions curve, as well as an entrepreneur who wants to turn buildings into Teslas, which I think is a fantastic idea, and is doing so with a focus on climate justice and making sure it's served. So with that as our sort of framework, I'd love to introduce our panelists and get into this discussion. So today we're joined by Kate Brandt. She's Google's Chief Sustainability Officer. We're also joined by Jessica Hyman, who's the head of sustainability at Atlassian. And then we have Donnel Baird, who's the CEO and founder of BlocPower. And Donnel, I got to also give you a shout out. I saw that you are officially on Time's 100 Next list as of yesterday. So congratulations on that. And thank you for being here. And thanks to everyone for being here today. It's really wonderful to have you. So I want to hop right into it, and I want to first ground us maybe in what happened last week. As Satchie said, very busy week. I'm still catching my breath between Climate Week and UNGA here in New York. Now, Kate, I know you were here for last week. Hopefully you've maybe caught your breath, but I'm really curious to hear from you. You know, from a tech perspective, what were some of the big themes and things that stood out to you when it comes to the intersection of tech and climate last week?
Yeah, thanks so much, Brian. And it was wonderful seeing you in New York. And I think I'm almost caught up on my sleep. But it was an excellent week. And I've been attending UNGA Climate Week for probably over a decade. And I have to say, I think this was probably one of the most robust and interesting weeks that I've had the chance to participate in. A few reflections I'd share. You shared, of course, the backdrop of the many global challenges and crises that we're facing. At the same time, I also did feel like we were there in New York at a moment of some optimism around climate. I think we are seeing some really important progress, like having 80% of global GDP and greenhouse gas emissions now actually covered by economy-wide net zero targets. I know we're going to talk more about the IRA later today, but obviously the passage of the IRA being a huge deal for accelerating action in the US. Also, the energy security crisis in Europe being a major issue, but also a potentially important accelerator for climate action. So I think we were coming together in New York at an interesting moment. And early in the week, someone reminded me that there are 88 months left of what we've been calling the decisive decade, right? 88 months until 2030. And I think that really focused the mind. And I found what was really also positive about last week was we've kind of shifted from what I've been calling pledges to progress. It was much more about how do we roll up our sleeves? How do we partner? How do we work together? And of course, as I was entering into a lot of these conversations, and I know other colleagues on the line today as well, what is that role of technology? And that's very much what I spend a lot of time focusing on here at Google. How do we, of course, lead by example in how we operate our own business? But most importantly, how do we provide tools for other businesses or cities that have set bold climate targets and are trying to achieve them? And also, how do we meet the growing demand of individuals? I think what's also really powerful about this moment is that individuals actually want to get involved. They want to take action, but they're not always sure where to begin. And so that was another key theme that I was bringing to the conversation last week of how do we utilize technology to enable people to take action on climate. So overall, busy week, good week, and excited to talk more about it today.
Well, I appreciate that. And I like to hear, that sort of idea of bringing things from both that high level, sort of corporate or even like national commitment and that individual level, kind of meeting somewhere in the middle. And Donnel, I feel like you're actually working kind of in that middle ground, both, from the building and city perspective. You work at BlocPower, you're working to decarbonize buildings, bringing in, heat pumps, solar panels, and other technology that not only decarbonizes them, but makes them, makes electricity bills lower. I'm wondering if you can tell us a little bit about, from your perspective, when it comes to the UN and these high-level talks, does that sort of trickle down to you and how you think about your work? Does it have an impact in terms of what you're thinking about going forward?
No, not really. We were privileged to be in Glasgow and got to hang out with Vice President Gore as he helped to, of course, structure and lead the last round of climate talks. And it was interesting to see the way the broader business community and tech community approached like the summer Davos thing that happened and how the sustainable development goals set a set of like milestones, or John Doerr would say OKRs, that the business community and the tech community can meet as we all think about how to solve the climate crisis. So I think like setting the context or the framework and the sandbox that we all play in is helpful. But at the building level, the conversation is, can you persuade a building owner that our products are better than the fossil fuel alternatives that they currently use? And as we shift into decarbonizing whole cities, what's it really going to take for us to move in Ithaca or a Menlo Park? Or I think I can announce today, yesterday it was announced that we won the contract to decarbonize the city of San Jose. So all of the buildings in the city of San Jose, which is one of the biggest cities in the country and in the world, how do you decarbonize a whole city in 88 months, right? And can you do that in a way that really inspires other cities to do the same? Kate talked a bit about, Google leading by example. How do we do things in such a way that we have like example companies and example cities where we share data, share inspiration, and do things in a way that other stakeholders can kind of duplicate and learn from our actions. So I think that's how that's how the Sustainable Development Goals can set a framework for all of our work.
It's interesting. But you're telling me so building owners aren't exactly thinking about those SDGs and their considerations.
They're not. They're building owners think about depending on their income level, they think about their energy cost as a percentage of their operating income. They think about the profitability of their building or the lack thereof. They think about the comfort of the tenants. Sometimes they care, sometimes they don't. They care about the health of the building, and they care about the regulatory and policy infrastructure in which they have to make money. But they don't give a darn about climate change. Even folks who care about climate change as early adopters or affluent, Tesla drivers, there really needs to be a compelling value proposition to each and every building owner that makes sense financially from a health standpoint, in addition to, hey, this is going to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And so to get to scale, greenhouse gas reduction right now in America is not a primary driver for building owners to make decisions. So there's got to be a secondary and tertiary driver to help compel those decisions, unfortunately.
Well, maybe that'll change in time. We'll see. I mean, once you have those examples, maybe that starts to get people thinking a little bit more, in line with the various aspects and reasons to decarbonize. I'm curious. I mean, Jessica, with your work, I mean, you've written that employees and investors alike kind of place a premium on sustainability, and so I'm curious for you. I mean, are you experiencing that at Atlassian? Like, is there that pressure from outside the company or even within the company to implement sustainable policies more aggressively than if it was just kind of operating in a vacuum?
Yeah, I think we're seeing sort of multiple forces play out at once. And the starting point for us was actually really coming from a leadership position and saying, look, at Atlassian, one of our core values is don't fuck the customer. And we kind of said, hey, we need to extend that. And it's really don't fuck the planet. And so what does that mean for us? We have to set ambitious net zero goals ourselves and make sure that we're really role modeling that for our peers and businesses and governments. And so coming from a place first of saying, hey, this is our responsibility. But then you also get this added benefit of being really in lockstep with your team. And I think there's this groundswell from Atlassians to take really aggressive climate action as a company, but then also for our leadership to voice a strong opinion here around expectations that we have for governments to kind of work with us. And I think we get that same leadership coming from the other side, from investors that are saying, it's great that you're doing your part and that you've set that zero goal. Also, we want to see how you are understanding the realities of climate change and how that may impact your business. And what are you sort of doing now to manage that risk? And you've also got the board coming at you and saying, hey, we care about this. This is part of how the business is going to become a 100-year-old plus sustainable business. Show us how you're sort of managing these risks and actually, frankly, opportunity into the future.
Well, it's interesting. I mean, to hear it framed as both the risk side of it. I mean, clearly that makes a little bit of sense. You don't want to have your servers underwater or whatever it might be, but also the opportunity. I'm wondering if you can tell me a little bit about, I mean, what are some of those risks that you're facing right now and how are you maybe turning them into opportunities?
I think for any business right now, your risks are going to be slightly different. But for us, we're thinking about just the very real reality that we're all seeing today of just extreme natural disasters and what that means for our team, what that means for our customers, what that means for our suppliers. You're also looking at the cost of energy, which is required to run our business and how we think about that from now into the future. And then there's this sort of macro risk, which is like, if we don't have a healthy planet and people that can be part of this ecosystem that we operate in, you've got no chance at running a business. So you have to sort of see yourself as operating within this broader ecosystem that needs to be healthy and stable for us all to thrive.
Mm-hmm. And so, yeah, by the way, I love the don't fuck the planet line. I think every company should maybe adopt that. I don't know, Kate, maybe you can talk with Google and see if they're willing to pick that one up.
I may have a sticker for you, Kate.
We actually ran a YouTube campaign with a similar name.
I love it. Well, I think I'd love to see that bumper sticker plastered all over the place. It speaks to me anyways. Kate, along those lines, I mean, when it comes to SDGs, I mean, like I said, the world is off track to meet them. The most recent Sustainable Development Report found that, we're actually backsliding on it, on those SDGs. And that's in part because vulnerable countries are not able to recover from the pandemic. Either they're having a sluggish recovery or no recovery at all. And I'm curious, Google as a very large company with lots of resources, particularly when it comes to data, are there ways that you see that data either helping in getting your SDGs sort of progress back on track, and particularly when it comes to vulnerable countries, because those are countries that either don't have access to data or they may not have the data at all in the first place. Are there ways to help them in particular?
Absolutely. This is something that we've been focused on for a long time, frankly, going back to 2015 when the global goals launched. And I think in particular, we've been really interested in the role of AI in helping the world to meet the global goals. So in 2018, we launched an initiative called AI for Social Good. And here we've been really focused on applying research and grant making to efforts that support the global goals and utilize AI solutions. And then actually just last week at the UN General Assembly, we announced a new initiative that is called AI for the Global Goals. That's $25 million through Google.org, our philanthropic arm, to support NGOs in their use of AI for solutions. And so this is grant dollars, but it's also an opportunity for us to bring Google Fellows to the table to provide support. And a couple of examples I would share, we were talking before the panel around the huge impacts that we're seeing of climate change across the world and the need to adapt. And we've actually seen really powerful opportunities for AI to address some of these challenges. For example, flooding, right? This is top of mind for us as we're seeing the devastation in Florida and elsewhere right now. We've been working to utilize AI to do better flood forecasting and to provide more effective alerts for both governments and people so that we can save lives. And we now have these alerts deployed in India and Bangladesh, and they're reaching about 250 million people. Same thing with wildfires. I know where I live in Northern California, we've seen just the unbelievable devastation from wildfires. And here we're using satellite data and AI to provide more real-time safety information that's helping communities as they're dealing with wildfire. And then hurricanes, we were just discussing hurricanes, same thing. How do we utilize AI to better predict hurricanes, to provide search and maps alerts to communities? So those are just a few of the examples, but I think huge opportunity for tech to be addressing the global goals, and we're really all in.
I mean, that's interesting here because, again, like thinking about the different levels that you're thinking of working at, from the high level to the individual level, how are you making sure that those tools that you're talking about are things that people want to use and apply? I mean, what kind of stakeholder work are you doing to make sure that you're on the right track when it comes to applying this AI to a specific problem and helping people solve it?
Yeah, something else that was a theme last week as well was partnership, and that it's so important for us to do this work in partnership. And also I mentioned, at Google, one of our core values is we put the user first. So we always want to be building tools and solutions that are most helpful for the people that we're trying to reach and support. And Donnel, mentioned cities. This is a place where we've put a lot of our attention. And for many years, we've been partnering with the Global Covenant of Mayors, C40, and ICLEI to work with them to really understand what is it going to take for cities to meet their climate action targets. Cities represent 70% of global emissions. They're in many ways on the front lines of climate action. And Donnel, you actually mentioned San Jose, which is one of my favorite examples. So we have this tool called the Environmental Insights Explorer, and it has information that we have curated based on the feedback that we've received from cities. So this is things like the carbon footprint of buildings, transportation emissions, the solar potential of rooftops. And San Jose, when they were putting together their climate action plan, they knew they wanted to set a bold target for solar. Very sunny place, but they weren't entirely sure, how could they right size that target to be ambitious but achievable? And they actually used the data in this tool to assess the solar potential of their rooftops and then set a gigawatt solar target. So that's just a really concrete example of, we see cities as a key place for action. We've worked with them hand in hand to develop a tool that they can really make actionable. And now we're starting to see great results from that.
Well, that's great to hear. And I'm curious, Donnel, I mean, you're working with the city now, or you will be soon working with the city of San Jose. I mean, is having that kind of data there either so the city can make the case to itself, or is it you having it in hand? Is that helpful for you when it comes to actually convincing entire cities to pursue the kinds of solutions that you're working on?
Yeah, I mean, we think the environmental insights tool that Kate's talking about has been incredible. I mean, several hundred American cities over the last few years, during the Trump administration, frankly, really took responsibility for passing robust local, city scale climate policy. San Jose being among one of the largest cities in the world to say, hey, we're going to be 100% carbon free by 2030. This is a really massive goal. New York City, I think we're 40%, by 2030. And, we were talking with San Luis Obispo out in California recently, and they're 40% by 2030 as well. And we were able to use, data models and tools to say, well, that's a great goal, but like, here's what it's going to look like in terms of implementation. It's actually like, you actually are going to have to do like 60 to 70% of your buildings will need to be retrofitted by 2030 in order to get to a 40% overall reduction, for example. Or here's the percentage of vehicles that will need to be changed, and here's the kind of EV charging infrastructure that you're going to need across the city. So getting into the block by block, building by building level details of how to decarbonize a city, which has to be done on a building by building basis, right, is a really great use case for machine learning and statistical modeling and AI. We think Google is obviously an incredible leader in doing that and working with the hundreds of cities who've set like really aggressive goals for themselves and giving them confidence that those were the right goals to set. I think the next question is, all right, like we got to decarbonize a few cities, hopefully quickly, and open source all of the learnings and best practices and like data, whether it's construction data, financial data, mechanical engineering data, machine learning algorithms. All that stuff needs to be open source and shared so that the next wave of cities that want to decarbonize can build on the foundations that have been provided by the kind of early adopters of these 40% or 50% or 100% clean energy goals in these urban markets.
Yeah, so I mean, it's interesting. It's kind of a good segue to think about, in the Trump years, obviously there was like cities and states were kind of holding the line on climate action. And now we have a whole different landscape with the IRA passing. That is, in my experience at Climate Week, that was one of the things that people just kept referring to over and over as a game changer. And I think it's interesting because the IRA is, it's kind of the climate. I feel like we're always at a yes and approach. And the IRA is kind of the yes and the and is TBD, I guess. We'll see where we go. But it's a great foundation to build off of. And I wonder, Donnel, just to think about that foundation from your perspective, does the IRA, what kind of impact is that going to have when it comes to getting maybe some of these other cities or states to start stepping up their ambition from like where they're at now to something that's a little more maybe aggressive in terms of decarbonization?
Let me express some negativity about all of this first before I'm super positive. So, I mean, I feel like Kate, maybe Jessica, you were as well, where it was involved in the Obama administration. We passed like massive, the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, the stimulus, the economic recovery package that was passed in the first term of the Obama administration. There were massive amounts of money that were invested in clean energy, electric vehicles. $500 million was loaned to Tesla and Elon Musk, which like everybody forgets about, but was really critical in helping Tesla reach its next inflection point. And the question for DC is like, they passed the law, and it's amazing that they passed this law, but the system seems to be focused on like getting the money out of DC and like out to the states, and then it's kind of up to the states, in particular the state energy offices, to figure out how to use that money to implement greenhouse gas reduction and job creation and green infrastructure on the ground. And, a bunch of the states are like Republican and like don't believe in ESG or climate change or whatever. If you look at the situation in Jackson, Mississippi, you have a state that has refused over decades to provide resources to a city, largely an African-American city, a working city, because of the like local politics. So part of the question is the devil's in the details of how we implement this thing. And really, I talked to John Podesta last week. Jessica, Kate, I don't know when's the last time you did. And I was like asking some like really tough questions. He was like, I don't know, Donnel, like we really welcome you guys like thoughts and feedback. So I think it remains to be seen what the specific details of how all of this capital rolls out from DC to the states, to the cities, to the counties, to the building owners, down to the ground level. For example, we're very focused on, the $9 billion that are going to be invested in incentivizing heat pumps. We think it's incredible. But where do you get those incentives from? Are you going to get it from your contractor when they visit your house? If so, does that contractor need to like have a specific certification? Or should you go to Lowe's? And is Lowe's going to give you the certification? Or do you need to apply to the city of San Jose government? Like, how's it going to work, right? And like, what's the most efficient and effective way? And I do think as leaders in tech, using our voices and relationships to help with the implementation challenge to ensure that this massive, like once in a generational policy achievement, this legislation of the IRA, is like super effectively implemented on the ground in a way that optimizes and maximizes greenhouse gas reduction. I think that's really important. And I think that the tools, that the technology industry, Kate's been talking about the Google city scale tools. All of those tools are important in helping to figure out and plan how to optimize and maximize for greenhouse gas reduction on the ground.
I appreciate that. And I think that, the devil is always in the details with these things. I mean, there is the Justice 40 initiative that the Biden administration has, but there are obviously, challenges to implementing it. So we've covered actually that Indiana's EV charging plan was a problem with the NAACP and other groups because it was not a just plan. It did not actually distribute the resources as a just plan would. And so I think that you're absolutely right that we have a foundation of great money to build on, and now it's incumbent on getting it to the right people and doing it in the right way. And I am curious. I mean, you say the tech industry does have a chance to raise its voice, and the tech industry has been very vocal in terms of its support of climate legislation. And so, for both Kate and Jessica, I'm curious. I mean, as the folks that are running sustainability at your companies, how do you make sure that you're being a voice for good in the context of getting this money used the right way? Are there ways that you can either speak out, or are there ways that you can provide the tools to make sure that folks are getting the resources that they need to decarbonize?
I can start, Kate, and then I'll pass it to you. I think, Atlassian has thought about our role as, first of all, we have to set science-based targets and sort of lead by example here. But then in parallel, I think we have no illusions that business and government have to move together. And we see this again as this like team effort. And if you think about this movement sort of at scale, that means that we have to be supporting with advocacy and real advocacy. And I think if I think about just the last 12 months, we've been involved with groups like the We Mean Business Coalition, signing open letters to the G20 leaders. We've signed series letters to Congress supporting clean energy. And that sort of activism goes back to 2019 when we first set our RE100 goal and said, it's one thing to set the goal internally, but then you have to use your voice and your platform to push for that bigger movement kind of at scale. And I think it's really interesting that Donnel and Kate brought this back to actually cities, because we see these things as kind of needing to happen in parallel at the sort of scaled government legislation, and then at the company, showing leadership and actually getting the work done at our altitude. And so I think when you think about sort of taking that down to the IRA, we're looking at this sort of wave of teamwork and consistent drumbeat over time that gets you to this legislation. And then I think the question is, okay, now that we're here, how do we celebrate the moment and see this as a foundation, but then think of this really as the foundation and as the springboard for sort of what happens next? And it should be this sort of forward-looking, how do we now make bigger commitments? How do we see this as a signal that we can accelerate the pace that we thought we could go and actually achieve our goals faster? And how do we kind of do this as a collective?
Yeah, no, I definitely want to build on the great points that you've both made, Donnel and Jessica. So yes, I completely agree that partnership is so critical here, right? That's a theme. And that goes for engaging in policy action as well. So we at Google, we have a commitment to be net zero by 2030. Embedded in that is our moonshot goal that we want to operate on 24/7 carbon-free energy by 2030. This is a very hard objective to achieve, and it absolutely requires policy change and policy action to get there. And so we have been very vocal for many years on the importance of policy action, the importance of partnership. And I know from my days in Washington, what I always found most helpful was when companies could come to the table with really specific recommendations. So we've done that as Google. We published a white paper just a couple of months ago on what do we really need to achieve 24/7, a clean electricity standard, keeping nuclear online so it's safe and operable, getting coal off the grid, et cetera. And And we have said we need to come together in partnership. And so we've been founders of initiatives like the Clean Energy Buyers Alliance. This is over 300 companies that are pushing for a 90% carbon-free grid by 2030. Also the 24/7 Global Compact that we've joined, that we helped to found with UN Energy and SE for All. Again, groups of not only companies, but cities and national governments coming together to say, how do we actually get to 24/7, the technology that's needed, but also the policy action that's needed. So I have to say, I think the IRA is a really big deal. And it's really going to be crucial for us at Google in achieving those bold objectives that we've put out there that I've mentioned around net zero and 24/7, but also around these coalitions as we're all working together to achieve those objectives. The other area, I think, to build on a little bit of what Donnel was saying is I'm also really excited about our opportunity to help from an implementation perspective. And I think one of the places that we can play a really useful role at Google is, I talked already about how we want to give our users information about how they can live more sustainably, whether that's eco routes in Google Maps or showing the carbon footprint in Google Flights. But also as they're trying to buy a heat pump or get solar on their rooftop or purchase a new EV, we want to make that easier for individuals, providing them helpful information, and then also highlighting what are those incentives that they can take advantage of and how can they go out and actually utilize those, as Donnel was saying. How do we reduce that friction to action?
Yeah, I think that. Yeah. Go ahead, Donnel.
Well, I mean, I obviously am going to be emailing Kate to harass her about San Jose, since Google has so many employees in San Jose. Like, can we green their buildings, and how do we, some of them are working remotely, I imagine. What can we do to incorporate that? We've talked with Apple about Apple has this goal of every Apple customer, Apple is supposed to figure out how to help reduce greenhouse gas emissions of every Apple customer. I work with I'm on the SEC advisory board for the climate disclosure law. We're definitely going to pass it as soon as possible to force all publicly traded companies to talk about their emissions footprint across their entire supply chain. And so folks are going to figure out who are my suppliers and where are my data centers and where did stuff come from and who is delivering whatever from which warehouse, and do my delivery vendors, are they green? And that's going to be part of the reporting that everyone has to do. So I really encourage, I love the broad scale and scope of IRA. When we were all in DC a week or two ago, it was a party. We all were celebrating. For those of us who have worked on these issues for 5, 10, 15 years, 20 years, to get to this point is unbelievable. But as a parent who has kids, and we got to rapidly reduce greenhouse gas emissions, focusing on implementation. We can only celebrate so much. And I want to encourage and challenge as respectfully as possible, in the way that acknowledges the incredible work that Atlassian and Google are doing. Why don't you guys race to green San Jose and race to green Sydney and see who wins by 2030?
I like this. The gauntlet's
So Donnel, I want to brag on you for a minute, because as you're articulating, we already know each other, and it's been so amazing getting to know you through the Google for Startups Climate Change Accelerator, and I think the work you are doing is tremendous, and I love what you're saying, and I have often remarked recently, this is a race to the top. I think this is so critical, as we have so many companies that have now set really important, bold targets, that it's all about what I was saying at the beginning. It's about pledges to progress, and it's about our coming together and getting the work done. So I love the push. I couldn't agree with you more. And it's been such an honor working with you, through our Startups Accelerator program. And I always want to find more ways to work together. So we're going to talk after.
Okay. Thank you.
I love this. I love that we're making connections on this panel, or making reconnections, as the case may be. This is great. I do wonder, because I think the idea of a race is really interesting, but it's also, if Google wins the race, right? But everyone else is still at the starting line, that doesn't leave us in a particularly great place. And so I wonder, as we're thinking about this, either for Kate or Jessica in particular, how does that work to both be race, but also making sure that you are helping your competitors along the way? Because we all do need to get across the finish line at some point, right?
Absolutely. And I really, just to again underscore, like, I think the partnership dimension of this is absolutely critical. The kind of systemic change that we're talking about can't be achieved by any one company. And so I mentioned some of the partnerships that we've been involved with for a long time around clean energy. Another, I think, crucial area that we also look at is the role of our technology in helping other businesses meet their targets. And I think that was another really nice thing about last week is, it was a chance for people like Jessica and I to get in the room with our peers, to roll up our sleeves and really talk about, like, how are we helping each other get there? And we've been particularly focused on that through our Google Cloud solutions. We see that companies really need solutions for, we talked about supply chain just a moment ago. How do they get better insights in their supply chain? We're all working towards that. And so we've teamed up with companies like Unilever through platforms we have like Google Earth Engine. We have this incredible planetary scale tool that now a company like Unilever is using to say, hey, we have the zero deforestation goal. This is critical from a nature perspective. This is critical from a climate perspective. But they're really having trouble getting those insights up their supply chain in areas like palm. Now they're using our tools to get those insights and actually take action on their goals. So partnership is critical. I think technology is going to play a key role, and that's very much what we're focused on.
Jessica, I'm curious about you. I know that your supply, Atlassian has set a supply chain goal of getting 65% of your supply chain to set science-based targets by 2025, which is great. And I'm curious, how you view that part of the supply chain partnership, as well as, if you see partnerships across the big tech divide, so to speak.
I love this line of questioning because my team were just making fun of how competitive I am last week. So I think, there's this, I think we can hold both. There is certainly this sort of energy and motivation around a race to the top that is important. And Donnel, we should talk about Atlassian Sydney headquarters and our net zero goals around that building. But I think, the team always reminds me that this really is about a teamwork effort. And it's not just, businesses and governments, but then it actually becomes about Atlassian thinking, okay, who is on our team that we can help support to get there? And we started with suppliers and just said, look, as part of our science-based target, we actually have a responsibility to make sure that 65% of our suppliers have their own science-based target. And it's not a small level of ambition to get there. And we realize that. And so the approach is not one of like, you have to get there or we'll drop you, but more of, hey, how do we partner with you and help walk this road together? And so we started out this year by just engaging with our top 10 suppliers and saying, we have this goal. We've put some resources out on our supplier site that walk you through how we set a science-based target and just take away some of the feeling that this is impossible and kind of try to light the path along the way and then share. So, Kate has mentioned this as well, but there's a lot of forums we're using to partner with other tech companies or other companies with science-based targets to really talk more about what's not working than what is, right? We need to understand each other's lessons learned so that we can all move faster together. And I think at the end of the day, all of us see this as a sort of collective, how do we accelerate progress as quickly as we can? And that comes from kind of working together and supporting each other and not just putting out the call to action. We put out a New York Times ad, I think last November, that basically said, hey, companies, businesses, you have a responsibility to act. We need to see you set science-based targets. But at the same time, we're having calls with our peer companies sharing how we've done it and putting out a sustainability report that really leans into, here are our lowlights, actually. Here's what is not working. Here's where we're getting slowed down and here's why. And just remaining really committed to this openness. Another one of our values is open company, no bullshit. And just really leading with both our data and our progress and like where this is hard and where the friction is so we can share that with others.
Yeah. Amazing. I mean, it's amazing. I mean, Google and Atlassian are some of the most incredible companies in human history in terms of the efficiency of the business, right? For both of you, what the companies have achieved has been remarkable. And I think the way that you guys are leaning on sustainability is amazing. I think to go back to this idea of like, well, if the NAACP is upset in Indiana because the electric vehicle charging plan isn't like equitable, like one reason to be concerned about that is like, oh, well, it's not fair. And we're like equitable, ethical people, we're like liberals or progressives who care about, everybody having a piece of the climate change because we are good people. But like the flip side of the coin is like, if we don't figure out how to rapidly develop like mass market products and services, not only for certain segments of the market that have more resources, but for like folks who don't have resources, we won't achieve the greenhouse gas reduction that we need, and we also won't have the kind of political and policy coalition that we all know that we need to pass IRA 2.0 and 4.0 and 6.0, which is really what we're going to need. And so I'm really encouraged by what I'm learning from Jessica and Kate here about the amazing way that they're engaging so many stakeholders beyond the walls, if you will, of their amazing companies, right? Like going beyond to engage stakeholders outside their companies and really share learnings and best practices that they're learning from being on the bleeding edge of this climate fight. It's very encouraging.
Yeah, I mean, I'm very intrigued by that. And I do want to, obviously, we need the IRA like 10.0 right down the line if we really want to do this in the US. But I think it also speaks to the fact that we need, the IRA 1.0 in other places, or, whatever it might be, the Green Deal in Europe 2.0, as the case may be. And I'm curious, to hear either from Jessica or Kate, I mean, when it comes to thinking about this in terms of like a more holistic view, and maybe Jessica, this is good for you since Atlassian has a headquarters in Australia, right? And Australia recently just got a much more progressive government after booting its climate denier PM. So I'm kind of curious to think how you kind of link up, not just with other companies, but also work across the various places that you're working with, the various countries that you're working with, to make sure that those national governments are also on board, because it seems like we need this synergy to actually work and get us to a place where emissions reductions are happening.
Yeah, I was lucky enough to be at the Inflation Reduction Act celebration a couple weeks ago in DC, and Biden said something that has just really stuck with me since, which is that too often we confuse setbacks with defeat. And it just reminded me that regardless of who is in power and which government at this moment, we need to remember that this sort of consistent drumbeat wherever we have a platform to influence change is critical, and that you sort of don't take your foot off the gas sort of regardless of that market. And I think there are ways we can do this by leading by example. So if you think about being an Australian business, we were one of the first Australian tech companies to set a 100% renewable goal, or leading in setting the science-based target goal that we have, or thinking about our Australian headquarters that we're building out right now and how we make sure it has really strong net zero goals tied to it, and sort of setting an example in that market where we have influence, but then using our platform to advocate for progressive policy there as well, so that we're kind of doing both in parallel, and that regardless of the Inflation Reduction Act and the win that is, here in the US, that we see that as one win today that should be celebrated, and a foundation that hopefully can get built on in other markets that we're operating on.
Actually, I just want to make sure that we acknowledge to Donnel. I mean, it sounds like, can you get BlocPower over to Australia to check out this headquarters, or what?
That's right.
Atlassian has a lot of experts. They don't need us, but we're always happy to help wherever we can. We did get an email from some folks in Perth, Australia, saying that they're jealous of Ithaca and Menlo Park and San Jose, and they want to decarbonize the entire city of Perth. And so we are talking with them about that. As you guys may know, Rewiring America is a great advocacy organization for electrification of the building sector. And one of their co-founders is Australian, Saul Griffith. And so we are trying to figure out, could we even have a multi-continental strategy with the World Economic Forum, where on every continent other than Antarctica, we have a city that is part of a global grand challenge to really try to decarbonize a whole major city over the next 3, 4, 5 years. And then, as Jessica said, open source and share all the data and learnings with every other city in the world, so that as we learn best practices, we can apply those lessons to scaling urban decarbonization across the world. So we are working with the World Economic Forum and JLL and Lowe's and other folks to figure out, could you do a grand global challenge and have a bunch of cities race? Every city isn't going to be fortunate enough to have an Atlassian headquartered there with all their talent, or a Google, office there with all of their talent. Every city in the world is not going to have that, but a really collaborative, positive partnership that's, cooperative could really go a long way to restoring hope. Because I just want to comment. One of the things I heard last week that I should share that's really sitting with me is I was in a session and the moderator got anxious and asked everybody to raise their hands, everyone in the room, in the audience, like at Climate Week. They were like, raise your hands if you believe we're going to hit our emissions targets by 2030. And the room was filled with like experts, policy people, tech people, climate finance people who are 100% about mitigating the climate crisis. And no one raised their hand. Like, and so when asked, like, do you believe in your heart, right? Like, do you have hope that we actually are going to hit our emissions reductions goals? The truth is a lot of folks, at least last week in the session, don't really believe in our heart that we can actually make progress. So like, what are the kinds of things that we can do to restore hope, which used to be a really popular word in American politics in the Obama years, but what can we do to really give people that hope and a pathway to implementing a hopeful response to the climate crisis right now? And like, that's what I'm spending a lot of time trying to figure out.
I mean, I have to say, like, that's a very interesting situation to hear about, Donnel, because so I teach at Columbia, as you know, it's a night job, I guess, in addition to my day job here at Protocol. And I find a similar thing. A lot of my students who are, they're coming in, they want to work on this issue, they care. And, when I ask them to do assignments that envisions a good future, they have a really hard time doing that because that vision is just, that's not been the way the world's operated to date. And I wonder, I mean, Kate, like your company, large impact, I mean, reaching a billion users, lots of different technologies, lots of hands and different things. I mean, I wonder, how you view your role as a sort of global provider of information in terms of getting people to understand what's possible and why we, actually do stand a chance if we just start to do the right things.
Yes, this has been a big focus for us, as I mentioned. Of course, it's about how we lead at Google, how we're enabling our policymakers, our cities, as we've been talking about, other businesses. But I also think individuals have such a crucial role to play here. And I think what's really powerful is we've now reached that moment that, Al Gore has been talking to us about for such a long time. Climate is now a social movement. People want to take action. And we're seeing this at Google, right? We look at Google Trends to understand the zeitgeist of what's on people's minds. Searches for all the things we've been talking about. How do I get solar on my roof? Buying an EV, even, heat pumps are up at an all-time high. And so we're really thinking about how do we give people really helpful, actionable information? And so we're thinking about this in a variety of ways. We made a commitment a couple of years ago that by the end of this year, we want to enable 1 billion new sustainable actions. And so we've done things like we've teamed up with the UN. The UN has their UN Act Now principles, that these are like the 10 things as an individual that you can do around changing your transportation habits, how you power your home, what food you eat. And we're making that information available in Google search, but we're also trying to bake it into the Google products. And so, I talked a little bit earlier about things like eco routing in maps. This is something where now it's the default. So if you're using Google Maps and you're driving from A to B, we'll give you the least fuel intensive route as a default, as long as it has a similar ETA. We've already seen this being the equivalent to taking 100,000 fuel-based cars off the road just since October. Or we're also doing things like showing you in Google Flights, what's the carbon footprint of a flight? Or we've been talking a lot about solar and the work that we're enabling cities to do, also giving people information about the solar potential of their rooftops. Or the Nest Learning Thermostat. We now have this program called Nest Renew, where we're enabling people to shift electricity usage in their homes to times when the grid is cleaner. So I think there's such a crucial role for individuals to play, and I think we need to meet them in this moment to give them really meaningful actions that they can take.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point. I think, there's been a tension within the climate movement for years. Initially, it was, it's all individual actions. And then it was like, no, we need to shut down all the oil companies. And now I think we're sort of getting to this place where maybe it's a bit of a middle ground of we need to probably stop using the oil as much. We definitely do. But also, what can folks do? I mean, there's a lot of research in the IPCC recently that just showed that proving efficiency can get you to major gains at just like the individual or building or household, city level.
That's exactly right. I mean, I think it's like I've been saying, it's everything everywhere all at once. And so, yes, it's corporate action. Yes, it's policy action, but it is individuals too. And you're exactly right. In the most recent IPCC report in AR6, this was the first time that they really got into this role of this category of lifestyle emissions and said, there's at least 5 to 10% of opportunity here to address these emissions rapidly from individuals taking action. So I think it's now not only what people want to be doing, but it's also really grounded in the climate science.
Yeah, I like that. Everything, everywhere, all at once is definitely the motto, along with don't fuck the planet. I think that these two work pretty well together. So, in our close, we're getting close to time here. And so I do want to close by actually taking a quick look forward to the next big event, which is, of course, COP27 in Egypt. And I'm really curious to hear from each of you, maybe as a closing thought, what is something that you want to see coming out of those talks? Whether it's at the corporate level or at the international level or at the city level, for that matter, since cities do play a major role in these talks, to show that we're actually going to start making progress in bending that emissions curve from hitting record highs to starting to go down. And maybe I'll just call on someone first. Jessica, how about you? Would you like to hop in on that one?
Sure, happy to. I think for Atlassian, we really want to see this scaled movement as a team. And so what we're really looking for is business leaders showing up and making the big commitments, setting science-based targets, and using that as a moment and a platform to really say, hey, we're going to step into a leadership role. And I'm not just the CEO of my company responsible for the bottom line, but actually see my company in this broader ecosystem and context where I need to stand up for progressive climate policy and ensure that our government leaders are kind of taking on that challenge, and then seeing our government leaders kind of respond in that space. I think that creates, going back to your question before of like, is there hope or have we lost? And I think these big moments, something like COP, is necessary to keep this movement going forward and to feeling like we've got the velocity that we need to get there, and to create the environment where individuals feel like their actions matter. Because I think if you don't have that leadership from the top, it's hard to continue to have that motivation. And something like the IRA signals to individuals that, hey, from a policy perspective, we are going to help you kind of take individual action for electrifying your home, for example. And I think we need those moments along this long path to get to where we need to go.
Thanks.
I love that, Jessica. And just to build on that, I'm excited about COP. It's a few short weeks away, so I'll get to see all of you in Egypt. But I think for me, it again comes back to what we've been talking about today, what we were talking about at UNGA. It's all about pledges to progress. This is an implementation COP. This is about taking action. Many of the bold goals have been set that need to be set. Of course, there's some other countries that are still on their journey to setting those goals. But for the most part, I think the stage is set, and now it's about that implementation. And I think from the corporate sector coming and showing how are we taking action through our own net zero commitments, but also, as we've been talking about a lot today, the role of our technology or our products and solutions, whether it's a tech company or another company. How are we enabling other businesses to meet their objectives? How are we enabling individuals to take action? So that's really what I'm excited to focus on at COP. And, I think it's going to be an important moment as we continue to make progress.
Well, Donnel, I guess I'll give you the last word on COP. What are you looking at?
Great. That's a tough act to follow from Jessica and Kate. I mean, yeah, we were talking in Switzerland with some of the folks from Cairo about the prep work that they're doing, and it's interesting in the building sector, right? Like most of the buildings across the world aren't like skyscrapers or Class A office buildings that any of us would have our staff work in. It's like mom and pop, like small construction companies in Cairo that build buildings, which pretty much unregulated, right? They just kind of build a building that they think works. And again, how do you get to this mass distribution, like globally, of clean energy hardware and software, so that like local mom and pop construction firm in Cairo that's building an apartment building in Cairo or in Nairobi or Rio, that they are using best practices to build net zero buildings, and how do we get there? So I think those kind of conversations are super exciting, but I couldn't agree more with Jessica and Kate's comments and approach. Like, if we're talking social movements, I mean, I read a little bit about Gandhi, and one of my favorite quotes from him is, you have to be the change that you wish to see in the world. And Atlassian and Google are certainly that, right? They're like showing everybody like very clearly, like, this is what it looks like and feels like to be net zero in like this building or on this Google campus or in this city, with our workforce or with food, right? And so showing everybody very clearly what it looks like and feel like to be net zero and have climate success, I think is really important. And so as folks make these pledges that Kate was mentioning, I think, you know, having it transform from like, yo, climate tech is like a leap of faith and we're all like going to close our eyes and jump off together and hold hands into the great unknown, to like, no, we know where we're going. We know what it looks like and feels like to have net zero success. It's no longer a leap of faith, but we are the change that we want to see in the world, and we can speak confidently and clearly to others about what they need to do to follow us down that path of reducing carbon emissions. I really look forward to, you know, seeing more and more folks shift gears into the kind of work that Google and Atlassian are doing, and that's my hope for COP.
Well, I appreciate that. And I think that is a great note to end on. I think, you know, you've touched on a really important, I think, storytelling technique, which I think about as a journalist, which is show and not tell. Showing people the path forward is a way to get them to actually walk down the path. And so I think that is our challenge, both as, you know, well, for all of you as companies, as individuals, and also as the world. It's to show a pathway forward that's different than the one we're on, because we certainly need to get there if we want to get to net zero, and we want to have a climate that, well, it's a planet that's not fucked, essentially. But with that, I'd like to wrap our panel today. I want to thank our panelists so much for being here. I think that this was really insightful for me in hearing about how each of you thinks about climate. And also, I think it really speaks to, in hearing this sort of competition and collaboration, push and pull here, it speaks to something else that Antonio Guterres actually said at the UNGA last week, which is that, you know, let us work as one, as a coalition of the world, as United Nations. And I think that speaks to the fact that at the end of the day, everyone has to be on board here, both in terms of being the change, fostering that change, and also being a voice at the table to make sure it's a just change. And so with that, I want to leave us looking forward to just Egypt, and I guess about 5-6 short weeks. It's gonna, hopefully everyone here catches their breath one more time, and then we'll all be there and off to the races. But thank you again to our panel for joining us today, and thank you for our audience for being here.
Thanks,
Thank
Brian.
you.
Thanks so much. Great to be with you.
Good to see all of you.